My name is Father David Brown, a priest from the Society of Jesus, originally from the city of New Orleans, about 800 miles downriver from your wonderful city here of St. Louis, which has been so welcoming to me during my months here working at SLO. I am an astronomer who works at the Vatican Observatory in Rome and also in Tucson as well, where we have our most modern telescope. And it's a pleasure to be with you here for this Mass this morning. And of course, it brings back many memories just being with a university crowd of my own years when I was in college. In my case, I was at Texas A&M University. Freshman year for me was a time in which I could feel the excitement of a bigger world opening up before me, and in fact, a bigger universe for that matter, since I was studying physics. As my studies began, my university studies began, I was a physics major. And to my great surprise, my studies in physics, the more that I got into them, the more that I got actually into the details, the nitty-gritty, if you want to put it that way. My studies in physics actually prompted deep philosophical questions, existential questions, and ultimately theological questions in my life that ultimately led to a great blossoming of the faith, of my Catholic faith, in those years when I was about 18, 19 years old. For me, the study of nature, studying its beauty, studying its grandness, studying its order, all these things, I mean, looking at, for example, the structure of matter, the Standard Model, all these atoms and quarks and leptons and all these particles, or studying things like the Big Bang and dark matter and dark energy. Well, actually, dark energy wasn't a concept at the time. That wasn't until the year 2000. But my studies, amongst many other things in my life that wonderful freshman year, all those things were something that very much helped to lead me to a deeper experience of God and a very profound relationship with Him, the beginning of that, including my studies, most ironically speaking, because people think that it's usually the other way around, that your studies lead you away from that. But if anything, my experience was actually of being led to God through that. Ultimately, my vocation to the priesthood was born during the junior year of my university years, and I entered seminary in the years after college. I was ordained to the priesthood in 2002, and I've been working at the observatory there in Rome for the last 11 years as a research scientist. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience, once again, of just having my own faith deepened again and again, just through this wonderful ministry that the Church has, one amongst many ministries. So thank you very much just for the invitation to be with you here at Mass this morning. And with that, on to the homily. You thought that was it, right? Wow, that's a short one. Always beware when the priest tells you it's going to be a short homily, because you know it's never going to be like that. I suppose if it was the opposite, if I were to tell you that it's a long homily, that logically speaking it should be shorter. No, maybe not. Hopefully it will be reasonable. I'll begin with a quote that we hear from the Acts of the Apostles, and it's simply this: we must obey God rather than men. That's what we hear St. Peter tell his fellow apostles after they had been flogged and warned by the Council of Elders, the Sanhedrin, not to preach the name of Jesus, even if it means incurring upon oneself great suffering and probably death, of a martyrdom. And this obedience to God, this theme, is a theme that runs throughout the entire Scriptures, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. And we hear about it again today in the first reading of the Mass from the second book of Maccabees, when the 7 brothers and their mother choose death rather than to be made to break God's commandments by the king and his torturers. Why would people, under threat of torture, under threat of death, make that choice for death willingly? He is not God, after all, the God of the living and not of the dead. You would think that people would want to stay alive and not choose death so readily. Why would people make that choice for death, for martyrdom rather than for life, when life is much easier to embrace? Certainly in the Christian faith, martyrdom is something that is very much greatly respected, something that's a very strong part of our faith. And one very often hears the quote by Tertullian, who died in the 2nd century AD. Basically, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. For what reason would people endure such pain, such humiliations that we hear throughout the history of our faith, the 2,000-year history of our faith? We think about St. Thomas More, we think about the early martyrs during the Roman persecutions and all these things that are very much present to me when you walk around Rome and you see the sites and you see the relics of these saints who did suffer such fates. The answer is that it is, of course, done for the love of God in the end. It is not something that people choose against their will, but it's done for the love of God. And that makes the people who are witnessing these deaths think, why would they do that? It makes people witnessing these things put things into perspective and moving their hearts. Let me offer a couple of reasons as to why the phenomenon of martyrdom has always been crucial to the life of Christianity and in the church. First, and as just mentioned, it is done for the love of God, for love of God's truth, His goodness, His ways, His commandments. In short, some things are absolutely right and just for giving one's life for. St. Thomas More, at least if you look at the dramatization by Robert Bolt from a couple of decades ago, when he was asked by his own family why he persisted in his opposition to what King Henry VIII was doing, when asked the question, but in reason, haven't you done as much as God can reasonably want, already having spent a long time incarcerated in the tower? He responds to this by saying, well, finally, it isn't a matter of reason. Finally, it's a matter of love. The second reason is this, that it is a direct participation in the life of and imitation of Christ Himself, in particular, a participation in His passion, a participation in His cross, in His death, and yes, a participation in His resurrection, in which He works through the martyr's witness to the good of the world, to show something of the stunning beauty and mercy and love of God in an act that's done like that. We hear Jesus tell us in the Gospel of Matthew, whosoever desires to follow me must take up his cross and follow me. It's a very stunning statement, and one that a martyr radically does embrace to the point of giving his or her life in death for that. Third, and closely related to this, martyrdom is the moment for which the martyr comes into the fullness or culmination of his or her mission in this earthly life, his or her purpose given to them by God. As a case in point, the Jesuit priest, St. Paul Miki, as he was hanging on a cross, literally, thousands were crucified during the persecutions in Japan in the 16th century, 16th, 17th centuries, as he lay there hanging on the cross with people deriding him, with the multitude of people watching, including the faithful, said this. He says, as I come to this supreme moment in my life, I am sure none of you would suppose I want to deceive you. My religion teaches me to pardon my enemies and all who have offended me. I do gladly pardon the emperor and all who have sought my death. Think about that statement. As I come to this supreme moment in my life, these are not the words of regret of someone who feels like he has missed out on life, right? Someone saying, is this how it ends in the end? My life cut short at the prime of my youth? I had so much more yet to give. So much more that I wanted to do. So many plans made that will come to naught. We hear no talk like that. We hear, as I come to the supreme moment in my life. No words of somebody thinking that it has been a wasted life and a tragic end. They are the words of someone who is able to see in what was happening to him at that moment, the moment for which his whole life had been a preparation to accomplish his mission of giving such radical testimony to the beauty of God. The fourth reason, and very also closely related to love for God, is the manner in which the martyr dies, in direct imitation of Christ Himself, without fear and by praying for his persecutors and oppressors and pardoning them praying for one's enemies. This is the life of Jesus Christ working in a person like that. A literal, once again, living of what Paul says in one of his letters. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And only the grace of God can help a person to do that. These are young men and women, and old men and women as well, who gave their lives. You would think that somebody, right at the moment of dying, at the hand of the executioner, and usually in a very brutal way, would lash out at the enemy, right? Would curse them, would use foul language and all these awful things. Would at least say, I'll get you back. My family or my friends will find you. And I will have my vengeance, right? That kind of language that we very often hear in our world, right? Or you look at a Hollywood movie, it's all the same plots. I mean, usually, some good guy at the beginning of the movie suffers a great injustice, and then he spends the rest of his movie knocking off his enemies one by one until finally there's the great battle between the worst of the bad ones and the good guy. And then finally, with explosions in the background, the good guy finally wins after an almost, after almost dying himself. And by the combination of music and bombs and all these things, you're meant to almost feel that justice has been done and he got them all like that. Well, that is not the way of God. Okay. That is not the way of God. None of the saints ever yelled back saying, I'll get you. Okay? My ghost will, haunt you, whatever. They did not do that. They pardoned their enemies. Jesus says, God himself says, you have heard that it was said from of old, you shall love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. For the Almighty makes his rain to fall on both the good and the bad. And if you love only those who love you, then what credit is that to you? For even sinners can do the same with their own. But you be holy as your heavenly Father is holy. And here we see the literal living of that out right there. I gladly pardon the emperor. Edmund Campion telling Elizabeth, under whom he died, saying, we shall be reunited in heaven, and hopefully as friends. Perhaps another way of putting it is that we fight with the weapons of God when being attacked, not with the weapons of human beings, the weapons of cursing, of vengeance, of ugliness, of guns, all these other things, explosions. Rather, these are the weapons of God's righteousness, of the capacity to forgive, of the capacity to love the enemy, everything crowned by the virtue of charity, to be able to love the way that God does. St. Thomas More once again said in that wonderful dramatization, if we lived in a state where virtue was profitable, common sense would make us saintly. But since we see that abhorrence, anger, pride, and stupidity commonly profit far beyond charity, modesty, justice, and thought, perhaps we must stand fast a little, even at the risk of being heroes, and yes, martyrs. A sixth reason is that our fate of martyrdom, if it does come, is something that we should not fear, if and when it does come our way. While not seeking it out deliberately, unnecessarily, these are not things that you should seek out needlessly. If and when it does come, of the need to embrace it, should it come, for we are giving honor to God and to God's way. We hear the last of the Beatitudes, blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. Thus they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Finally, the martyred saints offer us their own prayers and their own help, their intercession, and strengthen us by their example. Is faith in God worthy of sacrificing everything for, including one's life? Yes, absolutely, is what our faith has always told us. Men and women are willing to do this because of their belief in the resurrection. The belief in the love of God, the fulfillment of which, the resurrection, of course, is in the life of the risen Christ himself, who is the resurrection and the life. And God indeed is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. Amen.